Hey everybody, welcome back. This is Jason, and as you know, we are on the second week of our 2-week break here at Historians of the Movies podcast. But that doesn't mean we don't have new episodes for you, or at least leftovers. So, in honor of both Thanksgiving this week and also High on the Hog Season 2, I wanted to come back and reintroduce you to an older episode about the film Soul Food with Adrian Miller and Mark Johnson. We had this amazing conversation back in the very early days of Historians of the Movies podcast, back when we were still figuring out what this podcast was going to be and what it was going to sound like. So these two guys came on very early on, and we talked about the history of this film, black cuisine, families. It was just a really cool conversation. So I wanted to come back and maybe re-release this to you guys. If you didn't hear it the first time around, this is actually one of my favorite episodes. And again, it's going to sound a little bit different because we were still kind of figuring out how this episode was going to sound or how the podcast was going to work and so forth. But I absolutely love the conversation we had. I actually love the two guys that we talked to that day. So if this is new to you, maybe a little leftovers, as I called it earlier, I hope you enjoy it still because it's still a great conversation, and I'm glad that you're here. So, new episodes coming back next week, but in the meantime, enjoy Soul Food, starting now. Welcome to the Historians of the Movies podcast. My name is Jason Herbert. I'm the creator of Historians of the Movies, allegedly the longest running watch party on the internet. Today, we're joined to talk about 1997 Soul Food. And I got two just awesome dudes today. Adrian Miller is a food writer. He's a James Beard Award winner. He's an attorney, but don't hold that against him. And he's a certified barbecue judge, which makes up for the attorney part, who lives in Denver, Colorado. He's the author of 3 books. Most recently, Black Smoke, African Americans and the United States of Barbecue, published by the University of North Carolina Press. And joining him with us today is Mark Johnson, who is a lecturer at the University of Tennessee-Chattanooga. He specializes in the history of the United States and specifically the U.S. South and African American history. In 2017, he published An Irresistible History of Alabama Barbecue, From Wood Pit to White Sauce. And in 2021, his new book, Rough Tactics, Black Performance in Political Spectacles, 1877 to 1932, came out with the University Press of Mississippi. Currently, he's working on a cultural history of bacon in the United States. Gentlemen, I'm hungry already, just like getting into this. My thoughts on white sauce already. We're going to jump into that at some point in time. But thank you so very, very much for being here today. I really appreciate you guys jumping in.
Good to be with you.
Yeah, same. Looking forward to it.
All right, well, let's jump in. I want to start with some basic stuff here about, what's food history and why does it matter?
Sure. So, food history is a critical examination of food and all of its contexts. It's mostly an interdisciplinary field. It has a lot of investment from science, art, sociology, anthropology, philosophy, ethics, history, of course, and so much more. And we're interested in things, in all sorts of questions, from food production to consumption to the rituals thereof and its effects on the environment and the economy. How does food contribute to systems of power, oppression? So we're interested in race, gender, colonialism. How does food mark identity, community boundaries? We ask those sorts of questions.
Yeah, I guess layer, just to add on that foundation, that wonderful foundation that Mark provided, I would say, it's the stories about what we eat, what we produce, cultivate in different ways, and then how we come together over food and how that connects us. And what I'm really fascinated to see is just, I see more and more people interested in the story of food, like what's the backstory of why we eat certain things. And a stronger curiosity. And then on the dining side, I just think, and we can certainly debate this, I just think the American palate is more open to adventure than it has ever been previously. I just think that people are really interested in what's happening around the world in food and trying to get a taste of it. So I think that's pretty cool.
Yeah, well, neither of you brought up this idea of What's really driving me with food history is totally the research aspect, because every time I see you guys posting, it's just like, oh no, here I am eating ribs again. This is like, or Adrian, you're off in like some other locale. Like that's why go into food history? Like what was, I mean, what was the driving force for you guys to like to jump into this particular thing, this particular field?
So the research aspect for me was an added benefit later. But I mean, the reason I got into it, the short answer is unemployment. Now, if you want to know more, yeah, I was working in the Clinton White House. And at that point in my life, I wanted to be in politics. So I was trying to get back from Washington, D.C. to Denver to start my political career. But the job market was really slow. I was watching a lot of daytime television. I'm not even going to tell you what shows. And then in the depth of my depravity, I went to the bookstore and I saw this book on the history of Southern food written by a guy named John Edgerton. It's called Southern Food at Home, on the Road, in History. I think a seminal text of food studies in the South. And anybody who's interested in this should just get that book. Even though it's, 30 years old now, probably. It's just a wonderful book. And in that book, he wrote that the tribute to Black achievement in American cookery has yet to be written. So I just thought that was really interesting. The book was 14 years old when I picked it up. And so I just emailed him out of the blue and I said, Mr. Edgerton, I loved your book. You wrote this one sentence and, do you think that's still true? And he said, yeah, for the most part, nobody's taken on that challenge and there's always room for another voice. So why not yours? So with no qualifications at all, except for eating a lot of soul food and cooking it some, that's what started my journey.
Yeah, I came to soul food also through an organization that Adrian knows well, the Southern Foodways Alliance.
Mm-hmm.
When I was a grad student at the University of Alabama, the Alabama Tourism Department wanted to do a Year of Alabama barbecue tourism campaign, but they had to know what the hell that meant. So they got together with John T. Edge and the Southern Foodways Alliance. They co-sponsored a grant. That grant, in a way, came to me and Professor Joshua Rothman at UA. So we did that work, and I kept going. In fact, my bacon book actually comes out of that research, too. I was interviewing a pitmaster in Birmingham, and he said that his family had been doing spare ribs for, more than 50 years, but they were going to switch to baby back ribs because butchers were cutting higher and higher up the sides for bellies, because for the first time, bellies were really expensive, and they could get more for them than spare ribs. And so his spare ribs kept shrinking and shrinking. And I just wondered, what else has bacon done to, the ways we used to do things.
That's interesting. I didn't know that.
You guys are talking about, first of all, I'm going to beg you for your thoughts on like best barbecue in the country. So that's definitely coming up. But, one of the things you both have keyed on this idea of the Southern Foodways Alliance. And certainly this plays these ties to the South play a very large role in this particular film. And Adrian, you were saying, the United States is huge, right? And you were saying the American palate is expanding and more accepting, maybe more than ever. What's Southern food? Like when you guys imagine in your mind's eye what Southern food is there a particular region? Is there a culture? Is there is there an experience or a time period? What makes Southern food different than like Western food or, Tex-Mex or something like that?
Yeah, when people ask me that, because often I get asked, what's the difference between soul food and Southern food?
Oh, yeah.
And if I'm being a jerk, I just say, well, soul food tastes better. But if I need to define it more, I think of Southern food as the name for the mother cuisine of the American South. And so I located all the states south of the Mason-Dixon line and some of the border states. So I kind of go back to that area and just try to define it geographically. And I call it the mother cuisine because I think it gives birth to other cuisines like low country cuisine, cuisine of Appalachia, Creole cuisine, Cajun. I think the Deep South is within that. And to me, what I argue is that soul food is really the food that Black migrants took out of the South and transplanted in other parts of the country. But certainly Southern food informs that. So that's how I think about it. So I think it's the cuisine, the region I think has the strongest regional identity in the United States. And, it's delicious. There's a reason why people talk about Southern food and love it so much. So that's kind of how I think about it.
I would agree with all that, but I would also add that there's an element of gastro-nationalism to Southern cuisine because it's trying to be everything, and it's trying to be hyper specific, but also trying to incorporate all these different groups that contribute to it. And it almost makes it difficult to actually then pinpoint. And so I'm thinking about Southern food as kind of also an invented tradition, something that that Southerners are creating as a way of defining like regional identity. I think they're kind of reverse engineering it. Like they're trying to prove the uniqueness of the South by pointing to a cuisine that is influenced by everything around it, but is also, as Adrian just pointed out, has also spread to the rest of the country. So you can't define its borders. You can't actually define what's included and what's not sometimes. But we know that it's the best, right? And we know, right, that it's the most authentic, as charged as that word might be. And so, yeah, I think it's a way of also like asserting, yeah, Southern uniqueness, Southern regional power.
Is there a certain level of racialized aspects to Southern food? We talk about this. I think about soul food. I tend to think about this in terms of an African American tradition. Adrian, you just came out with that awesome book that I bought several copies of as Christmas presents, Black Smoke, and I was thinking about I gave it to my mom's husband, right, who had who loves barbecue but wasn't really familiar with African American barbecue traditions and things like that. At the same time, I'm literally making jambalaya for dinner tonight, right? I grew up in Louisiana, and I tend to think of Cajun country as something maybe different, right? So what's and at the same time, I grew up also in Kentucky, which fried chicken is not race specific. I don't think it's not a regional kind of thing. So I was kind of wondering about are there racialized aspects of Southern traditions? You talk about low country and so forth. What about those? And are there gender productions as well, as far as who's making what Southern food, I guess, might be another question.
Yeah, so my take is that it was a combination of both. So for a long time, when people were talking about the cooks that epitomized the South, it was African American women, usually enslaved or the mammy figure. And there's certainly some men that get status as chefs and things like that, but it was Black women who really shaped this cuisine. And I tell people that Southern food, soul food, a lot of these cuisines tend to be a mixture of the culinary ingredients and traditions of West Africa, Western Europe, and the Americas. And all of these come together in different ways depending on, who's in the mix. So, when you think of the Cajuns, right, you're thinking about the immigrants that first were in Canada and then come down to Louisiana and have a distinct tradition. And in places like Low Country, you think of that as more Africanized because of the way that slavery developed with rice plantations. It was more of a task system. So people had more leisure time. It was more isolated. And so there's more African survival. So, just all of these sub-cuisines and even the South can play out in different ways depending on the mix of people. But yeah, no, definitely racialized. And one thing that I note is that in the 1960s, that's when the term soul food really gains currency, although it existed prior to that in Black culture, but it really gains kind of mainstream currency in the 60s. And there was a conscious divorcing of African-American traditions from Southern food. So people were trying to say, mainly Black power advocates were trying to say, white people can't understand these foods. And they would list these soul foods. And it was very much the stuff that white people were eating too. So, this was news to white Southerners that the food that they were eating for centuries, they can't understand. But that's when we start to get soul and Southern. And we get this conscious divorcing, because before that, it was just all called Southern cooking, regardless of who made it. It was just called Southern cooking. Then sometimes you would get more specificity, but it was called that. And so one of the more vibrant conversations right now in some food circles is this idea of culinary justice. After we have this divorcing of Black cooks from Southern food, and a high level, because for people in the South, the overlap between white and Black traditions, I think, is very fluid. But how do we bring Black cooks back into the Southern food conversations and acknowledge their contributions to Southern food? But one of the biggest surprises to me, and I'll turn it over to Mark because I feel like I'm talking too much, one of my biggest takeaways in my soul food book that I wrote, and what surprised me is, for the most part, people of the same socioeconomic status are eating the same foods, regardless of race, in the same place. So it's really more about class and place than race, has been my observation, which was a surprise for me because there's this narrative that soul food was wholly created for Black people. It's all the food that white people didn't want, and that just does not hold up to historical scrutiny.
I agree that that's one of the big takeaways from the soul food book. And then your assertion that we need to start thinking about soul food then as similar in that way to other kind of immigrant cuisines, right? When people come from Europe or Asia or elsewhere, now in the 21st century, they're going to eat like the people around them usually. But then you point out, what are the few things that they choose to keep with them? And those are the things that, as the movie shows, right, appear at the Sunday dinner or the special meal, birthdays, holidays, and other special events. And so, yeah, soul food then becomes it does work like an immigrant cuisine, thinking about it that way. They're taking a few special recipes that meant a lot, and they're not exactly reproducing how they ate on an everyday basis back in, those southern places.
Right.
They're carrying a few things with them, and they couldn't reproduce it exactly, even if they wanted to, because as your book points out, right, grocery stores didn't have these things. They had to create the grocery stores, but even still, right, you can't get exactly the same things. So, I think that's an important thing to think about soul food as a special occasion meal. And that shows a misunderstanding between, people like white dietitians and nutritionists blaming this for things, big part of the movie, right, diabetes, when that's not exactly fair, right? Because that's not the cuisine that's being, they're not eating that stuff every day.
Right.
Right. So it's unfair, and that puts blame then on them. Whereas there's so many other issues, right?
Exactly.
Food deserts, poverty and so on.
Yeah. And the environmental, consequences of racism, right? I mean, the stress of racism every day, you don't think that's going to affect your health?
Right.
Yeah. So we just need a lot more complex thinking about these things.
Yeah, I was thinking, you had talked to Adrian about the idea of like class and so forth, and I found myself we're starting to jump into the movie here, and we'll talk about it in a second. But I started recognizing a lot of these dishes when I would start to go to soul food restaurants, and then certainly that showed up in the film as the same stuff my grandmother would make on specific days, specifically New Year's Day. My grandmother would make purple hull peas and hog's jaw. And you had to, this was not an option. And it was always my grandmother enforcing this, no, you're going to eat it or it's bad luck not to eat it. I don't know if what that tradition, where that comes from, but I was like, wait, when I started, when I'm watching this movie, I'm like, wait a second, we have this as well, in the Upper South, in my family's history. And I was like, this is certainly so you're talking about a class, and my family comes from very working class kind of folks. This is a food source. This is a staple of that history.
Yeah. Well, though, my take on this so far, because I keep researching it, is it seems like those traditions were European traditions that get modified in the Americas. And so in a lot of cultures around the world, you eat beans on New Year's Day because they swell. And the idea is that portends for prosperity. Eating pork was meant to be for good health. And so that's why you have that. And then greens were for folding monies. In some cultures, there were lentils instead of beans or rice. So it's this idea of, fertility, swelling, all this kind of stuff. So what was interesting that happens in the United States is these superstitions or traditions, kind of people put them behind. They're thought of as just kind of old fashioned, primitive or whatever. And they somehow retained in the Black culture. And then African Americans kept this stuff on. And sometimes they were later then pointed to as the source of these beliefs. So that's why in my book, I wrote that in this case, with this specific tradition, Black people were the reverse Elvis because they took white culture, repackaged it, and reintroduced it to white people. So, but yeah, it's interesting. But it's one of those things that I do. I mean, every New Year's Day, I'm eating black eyed peas and greens for good luck and prosperity. And I have to say, having done the tradition for 50 years, the results are very mixed, but I still love the tradition.
Well, let me ask you guys this, right? Like, so when I first started coming up with this podcast and so forth, like I reached out to you guys almost immediately. I was like, who do I like to like see post? You guys both post because we all have this love of barbecue and food. And then it's like, okay, guys, what movie are we going to show? And you guys were both immediately like, okay, well, here's a couple different ideas. And then we talked about maybe fried green tomatoes as an option, but we both settled in on soul food almost immediately. Why this movie? Well, I mean, what drove you to this particular movie to talk about any particular movie?
Mark, why don't you go first?
I mean, I just took the title of your book and remembered it from 1977, even though I was only 10 years old. And probably didn't watch it until I was, in grad school maybe. But yeah, not a lot of sophistication from my end, because when I watched it as a grad student, I probably didn't think about it all that much. But watching it with a scholar's mind, I'm glad we ended up choosing it.
Yeah. So for me, it was the first movie that kind of depicted the cuisine. I mean, in a way that was very positive. Because I just can't think of a Black film that had food so centrally, a Black mainstream film. I just can't think of one. But it evoked a lot of the themes that people think about when they think about soul food. They think about family time, especially extended family coming together. They think about a matriarch or some kind of caregiver known for making this food. And you see also the idea of apprenticeship, that the daughters learn to do this and now the grandson has interest in it and he's helping out a little bit. So it just brought together a lot of themes: family, community, idea of a special occasion meal. They only did it on Sundays or, some other special occasion, but regularly a Sunday dinner. So it just tapped into a lot of things for me.
I'd never seen this movie before, as we were talking before we started taping that so I was like, went back in, started watching. I was like, okay, cool, soul food. And there's not a lot of food throughout the film. It only it serves as like these anchor moments. This kitchen is like this space where the family continually comes back to. And it's like, oh, okay, I see now this movie is actually about family, right? And then this idea of soul food and this idea of like preparation of the food and, eating the food is what holds this family together. What was really interesting to me, right, was that I kind of have to address the elephant in the room, because it felt like this is largely a female-driven film, right? It's largely, there are obviously male actors in the film. The narrator of the film is a young boy, and so forth. But the actors and the stories that are driven are largely female voices. It's centered around the matriarch of the family. The kitchen itself seems to be a female space. So what do three guys here have to learn from like watching this female space here? Like, I kept watching this going, here I am, I'm a white guy watching a film about, Black families and so forth. What can I learn from this, right? Is this a space where I can learn, what is this movie trying to tell me, as a guy who is not part of, say, who is not in that kind of storyline?
Yeah. To me, first of all, it's just a reminder, man, if you want things done, you have women do it, right? They get the things done. But I think also it just shows the artistry of this cuisine and how that is often downplayed. Like because like often people are, and you see this throughout history, especially with Black cooks, natural born cooks, it just downplays the expertise that they have in making this and what it takes to create this food. So I think it's a reminder of that. I think it's a reminder of just how much Black women have contributed to American cuisine, even in Southern cuisine as well. But if you learn the history, you'll find that Black cooks were everywhere, cooking all kinds of food. As a side note, Pizzeria Uno in Chicago, I mean, their chief pizza maker for like 30 years was a Black woman. So it's a not, no, Black people are everywhere cooking all kinds of food. Yeah, so I think it's a nod to that. So that's kind of some of the things I took back. It was just a reminder to me how much Black women and their expertise has been foundational to American cuisine.
I thought there were some really interesting like moments here too when they were talking about, these references. This film is set in Chicago, but there were some very real ideas. You were talking about this ideas like, that the grandparents brought this food with them from Mississippi, as they moved, straight up, this very traditional idea of the migration from the South to the North, right? And keeping those traditions alive. I was like, wow, there's these moments in here that's like telling us these other things that I didn't really expect. I didn't know what to expect, coming into the film as far as what it was going to teach me about geographics and so forth, right? And then like in Chicago, like where are these foodstuffs coming from? Are they being brought from the South? Or are they, Mark, you kind of talked a little bit about, consumption and so forth. Where, if you're in these northern cities and you're wanting to get, say, soul food and the things like that, to prepare this kind of stuff, where are you getting this? Is this stuff all coming from the old South? Is it, where are people getting this kind of stuff?
Oh gosh, I don't know. Adrian, do you want to take that one on?
Yeah, so what you see, and the way I picked up on this is I started reading newspaper articles and also just kind of dietary studies.
Mm-hmm.
And so, typically what happened is the migrants were arriving. They just really didn't have a lot of familiar stuff. And so, but as more and more migrants arrived, you do see local stores starting to cater to these newly arrived customers. So you start seeing more stuff. I remember seeing a newspaper article in 1921 in Chicago Tribune, I believe, that said mustard greens have arrived from the South. So it's things like that. And then you've got people who are coming up from the South bringing food with them.
Mm-hmm.
And then you've got these, to use language from today, you've got these supply chains that emerge where Southern foods are starting to be brought up. So I think it's scarcity at first, and then people are bringing the food up. And then as housing situations change and people are able to have a backyard and start having a garden, you start having people grow stuff there. And then as the populations grow, you start having street vendors showing up. So like south side of Chicago, there's a dude that shows up and he's just known. He's going to bring great watermelons from the South, and he's going to be at these certain corners during parts of the year. So you have that stuff going on. So I think it's a reflection as people are moving and more people show up in an area, the food soon follows. And you start seeing local grocers adjust and stocking things and stuff. But yeah, definitely at the beginning that it was hard to find stuff. Oh, and I'm sorry. One other critical part of this is you've got the restaurants providing this food. You've got churches where Black churches were very critical to feeding people when they were first arriving. And so there's several entry points where you get this food showing up.
The Great Migration also coincides with the rapid expansion of the industrial food system, since you mentioned supply chains. And something interesting I'd like to add to this is that a lot of the food that Southerners were eating, white or Black, is actually coming from the North because it's due to cotton monoculture in the South and other forces like destruction during the Civil War, specifically in my research, a hog cholera epidemic that wipes out, hog populations in the South. I mean, before the Civil War, Southerners, white and Black, got a lot of their pork, for example, from East Tennessee, Virginia, Shenandoah Valley. But after the war, they're getting it from Chicago. They're getting it from all the places that are still with us today because, landholders are importing it because they're importing it from Chicago because it's cheaper to get that way than to spare land to raise pigs. So, I think that's something to, consider when we're talking about where, they're getting ham hocks and hog jowls, right? It's probably coming from a major producer.
Well, I'm kind of wondering, right? So these folks are moving up to cities like Chicago, like Detroit, and I'm kind of wondering, alongside, there's obviously other folks who are moving into these cities. I'm thinking like the Polish diaspora in Chicago and so forth. Is there like a soul food fusion going on anywhere? Is there any kind of like a mixture of like where these kind of like traditions and cultures are kind of colliding and creating these other food, cuisines?
Oh, absolutely. I'll give you one example. So you see a lot of reports of African Americans going to Chinese restaurants. And a lot of times it was because the Chinese restaurant were less likely, not always, but less likely to draw the color line and accept their Black customers. And you have some interviews from these Chinese restaurant owners saying, why don't they try other stuff on the menu besides the pork fried rice and these other things? So what you see is people like they're seeing this new food, right? Something, but they're trying to find the familiar.
The food,
And so
yeah.
you're seeing people gravitating to certain things on the menu. And then there's a conversation because now there's something called hood Chinese, which is different from Chinese in other places. Yeah, in black neighborhoods. So you see a conversation happening over time. And then, just a couple of other examples, like you've got soul food egg rolls. So egg rolls filled with soul food ingredients. You've got Latino and African American fusion with tacos and stuff. This is more recent stuff. But back in the day, you see African Americans embracing foods from other cultures. So, tamales were very popular, not only in the South, but in these northern cities. So a lot of street vendors would sell tamales, something definitely from Latino culture that, it had ingredients that were familiar, right? It was ground up corn. Masa was kind of like cornmeal, and it had pork in it, and things like that. So you see a lot of that stuff happening. Those are the ones, I'm sorry I don't have them fresh on the top of my mind, but those are a couple of examples.
I'm kind of wondering, like, when I'm thinking about the movie itself, the only time I kind of want to circle back to this idea of like soul food versus barbecue and who's making what. Because the only time you see, I think, a man or a boy in the kitchen actually doing any of the cooking is whenever the little boy is learning to like do some of the stuff. And this becomes part of the theme. There's the thing with the spoon and all that, right? So I'm kind of wondering, is soul food exclusively prepared by women, or is that a feminine space almost exclusively, or can a man in the kitchen make soul food, or does a man's version of soul food, does that kind of go out into like the other maybe traditional masculine spaces like barbecue? Obviously, there's tons of great female pit masters in the country. I think we could all name them, right? But like, where does this like gender dynamic of like soul food kind of play into it? Like, who's doing what where?
Yeah. So interestingly, I just see Black women dominating all of these spaces when it comes to food, because like you just said, there are a ton of Black women who barbecue as well. So it seems like just the feel of it, it seems more like a case by case basis. It's just who liked to cook and who was the best cook in the family. Because there's certainly a ton of stories of men who were the great cooks. It's just more often than not, you hear about the women. So I don't know how that plays out. This is all anecdotal. I'm just going by feel, just based on what I read, and But they're like, I have a couple hundred of soul food cookbooks, and like 90% of them are authored by women, and but I got a chunk of them that are offered by men, and they were celebrated as being great cooks. Often they were professional cooks in restaurants or hotels or caterers. But when it comes to the home cooks, it just seems like you see women more often. That's just my feel. I don't know if you've ever seen a study of that, Mark, or anything.
No, I haven't exactly. And I agree with the things that you're saying is that, there is a gender dynamic in the types of spaces, Black women in the home kitchen, Black men in the restaurant kitchen, in the professional kitchen, as the ones that kind of, I guess, spread across, that get on our radar, whether it's in the form of cookbooks. And, I'm thinking about something like the Creole cookbook, the Times-Picayune Creole cookbook, that in its early editions, credited Black women for creating these recipes, and that it had to preserve these recipes because Black women were becoming upwardly mobile and not working for white people anymore. And so the cookbook had to translate Black women's natural talent for cooking to a scientific form of cooking that white women could understand so they could continue to eat the same things. But importantly, white chefs verified all the recipes, checked the work to make sure that it was authentic and that it would, So there is a dynamic in all of this, white people checking Black people's work. But I also think, especially these images on film and literature of Black women doing this cooking, I do think we need to also consider it as like a literary trope, right? As a character that is safe, maybe for the white gaze. I do think there's an element of that we should at least have in the back of our minds.
So much of this movie takes place inside a home, right? And I'm kind of wondering, like, how does this film, particularly, this is how this film maybe compares in its representations of Black life in the late 1990s. Film comes out in 97, so produced say 96ish. How does this film kind of differ, or what is this movie kind of showing us that maybe other films in the era don't, or how does this complement like what we're seeing about Black life in the United States, turn of the 21st century? What is this kind of movie showing us that maybe we don't see elsewhere?
Well, especially in the 90s, I mean, it was, it was the era of gangster rap and other things. So my take is that most of the films you see about Black people involve some kind of pathology. And there was almost a primacy on, showing gritty urban life, drug use, all this other stuff, without really showing other aspects of Black life. The other films that I would call positive and just showed other aspects of Black life were very, very episodic, from what I remember. So this was like a film that you could watch it. You saw your own family in it. And, some whack stuff happens, and that's part of family life. But it just seemed like it was more relatable for a lot of people because it was middle class, I think. Although, you had some upper middle class characters, Vanessa Williams, probably. But, I just thought it was something that was unusual in that it was like a positive portrait of Black life, home life. And, you had a great father, like Vivica Fox's husband, that family dynamic was, and so it just seemed more positive and relatable.
When I think about this movie as a product of its times in the 1990s, I was actually drawn to the character Lem. Mostly, I think because I'm rereading. It's around the 10th anniversary of Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow. So I'm thinking about like the Clinton era and the way he poses, right, as an ally, but also tough on crime, Hillary Clinton's, super predator comment. And I think, I really got attracted to the character Lem, because he's formerly convicted and he has trouble getting a job because mass incarceration follows him everywhere he tries to go.
And we see he's a very competent guy, right? When we see him in the workplace, he is I remember there's one particular scene in particular where the guy comes up and says, "Hey, do you know how to work that stamp machine?" And he kind of refers to it by slang because he knows that stamp machine so well. He's like, "Absolutely, I can know it." This is a very competent dude who just cannot seem to escape that that kind of stuff, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And then when he slips up again, right, he's going to suffer the most for it, right? There's no second chances, right? Even though we pretend to love second chances, that's not exactly for people like him. So, when I was putting this movie in the 1990s, that's something that came to mind. Also, coming back to our food story, I came to the scenes, where they're telling, their mother to watch what she eats, right, and take her insulin. I did a presentation based on a collection of African-American cookbooks at the University of Alabama, and it was slimming down soul food, right? So the pork industry and the beef industry and all these other industries, right? This is an era of the other white meat. And, they're pushing out ethnic and racial group specific cookbooks designed to alter the cuisine of these groups to, help them avoid diabetes, right? The central disease, in this movie, but, obesity and all those other things. And, they're telling, Black people that they can enjoy the foods they grew up with, right? But just switch out that ham hock for a chicken thigh. Substitute that bacon for turkey bacon, in those greens. And I think I went to one scene, right, where, one of the sisters is cooking and she asks, why do we have to eat ham hocks? So, I think the 1990s diet culture, this is also, Atkins diet is starting to pick up some steam here. No, the 1990s are an interesting moment for food and diet culture in the United States.
And if I can add to that, If you follow Black cookbooks of the 1990s, that's when you really start. It started in the 80s, but you really see a lot of momentum for health conscious or low fat soul food. You see a lot of those cookbooks come out at that time. People switching from pork to turkey, more margarine, instead of butter, vegetable oils instead of lard. So you see that happening in the 1990s.
When did Gladys Knight's cookbook come out? Because she dedicates that cookbook to her diabetic mother, I think.
Oh, I don't know when that came out. Because by that time, her restaurant in Atlanta had opened, right? The chicken and waffles place?
Yeah, I think so.
I don't know. That's a good question.
It looks like 2001.
2001, okay.
So right in this exact same era, we're talking about four years difference from when this film comes out. And Mark, you would kind of reference to, and we've talked about a couple of different scenes that kind of resonated. Certainly, I feel like one of the neat things about this film is it really shows the centrality of the family matriarch to this particular family. It's very much the grandmother's journey is kind of the backdrop of this entire story. I'm kind of wondering if either of you have any particular scenes in here that you really felt kind of resonated well with you as scholars or just as fans of film themselves.
I just thought the spread, man, when they got together, I just thought it was beautifully filmed. And I just, one of my biggest harps is I just don't think, I think soul food gets a lot of haterade. That's an academic term.
Yes.
And I just wanted to see soul food get more love. And I just thought a beautifully filmed spread just really gave soul food some love.
It's gorgeous. It's a gorgeously shot film.
Yeah. Whoever was the food stylist for that movie deserves a bonus. But yeah. And then, seeing that whole family together, sharing it, even with all the dynamics happening in the background, coming into that moment and just sharing and saying, this is about being together in this moment. This is great food.
Yeah, there seemed to be this moment right towards the end of the film. All the sisters are fighting. Everyone's you talked earlier on what made this film maybe a little bit different was the fact that it is not a chaotic household. It's not it's like, of course, every film has to have some hint of drama or you don't watch it, right? I mean, and the little boy says that was when everything went wrong and so forth. So we know there's going to be some drama unfold, right? At the same time, the moment that I really loved is like these sisters are all fighting towards the end. And then they all walk into the kitchen and they all kind of assume their places and nobody's talking to each other, but they're all still cooking, right? It's like that is set aside and we're just going to, Vanessa Williams, who I think there's a couple snide remarks that makes her different because she's not as good of a cook. It's like, oh, you can make cornbread. That's what you can do. You might be you might be the attorney. She continually points this out to the film, like, I'm the attorney, I make the money. But they're like, that's fine, but you can only do cornbread, right? There's this like, everyone has their role here that I really kind of enjoyed. That scene was very quietly shot. Everyone kind of goes in and they go to work, not saying anything.
Does Vanessa Williams' character, does her class status put her out of touch with soul food?
Well, I think that's what many people would argue because soul food is such a touchstone for Black culture. So, to the extent that you know how to make soul food and like soul food could be an indication of your level of Blackness, right? So, if you don't know how to make certain foods the right way, you could have your Black card revoked. That to use the current language. I don't think that was around in the 90s. But no, there is this feeling that class differences do affect soul food. But I mean, that's a recent thing because if you go back 30, 40 years, man, you've got wealthy African Americans eating these foods as well. I mean, the number of chitlin parties that wealthy people threw was pretty astonishing to me because I thought there was going to be this whole, no, we made it, we're Jeffersons, we've moved on up to the east side, we're not going to eat that stuff anymore. And that wasn't really the case. There's some of that, but I think there was a widespread love for these foods across classes. And I think it's because of the deeply held family connections and nostalgia of the food that I think kept that going.
Well, I've got to ask you guys this because we've been talking about food. We've been seeing very specific food. We've talked chitlins. We've talked barbecue and so forth. Like, is there a particular soul food? I mean, what's your favorite soul food recipe? We've been talking about this. I still have to eat tonight, so I'm already hungry, as I've said like an hour ago. Like, you got one soul food recipe. What are you going with? What's your go-to meal here?
Well, for me, it's mustard greens and turnip greens with some smoked turkey.
Ooh.
I just love that, man. And I put in, to season it, I have onion, garlic, and red pepper. But that the mix of the earthy turnip greens and the kind of peppery mustard greens, it's a great blend. That's how my mother cooked them. So I didn't really grow up eating a lot of collards. It was mustard and turnip greens. And she's from Chattanooga, Tennessee, and you'll find that in the upper South, you have turnip greens more often. And even when you go to restaurants, you'll see turnip greens more often than collards. So that's my thing, man. And I love it because even though those greens are not from West Africa, it's a nod to the food of West Africa, where greens are very central to the diet. And obviously, this dish was an adaptation of being in the Americas and not having the greens they got in the tropic areas of Africa. So what could they get here as a substitute? It's healthy. It's good for you, and it just tastes good. So that's mine.
I have to repeat the answer. Because that's not something I'm going to make at home. So if I'm in a soul food joint, I'm going for greens with pork, maybe topping grits or something like that.
Do you have a favorite soul food joint? Adrian's grinning, but he's probably naming like 14 in his head right now.
Yeah, I know. It's just trying to limit. But I know I got a favorite.
No limitations. Go now. We can be here all night. Like, I have one specifically way outside the South. I'm going to hit you guys with in a second. I think you'll recognize it the second I say it. But I want to hear what your thoughts. If you're on the road and you're driving, you listen to this podcast, where do you pull over to go get soul food?
All right. Well, so this is going to be an unfair answer because this place is no longer open, is my understanding. But
mine was no longer open, so I was going to let you answer.
Yours is no longer open as well?
No.
Okay, our new job is where can we reopen these? Okay, go on.
Yeah. So one place that I love is Bully's Soul Food in Jackson, Mississippi. It's the kind of place where off the main dining room there was a table and somebody would periodically come out and strip greens and kill sweet potatoes. In Cleveland, Mississippi, there's a place called the Country Platter, which is just really good seasonal food. In Atlanta, I love the Busy Bee, like a soul food joint there. And I'm trying to think the ones that are still open. Oh, and there's a place in Charleston called Bertha's. So those are the four that immediately come to mind.
So I did have Bertha's on the list. But yeah, in fact, I don't even remember the name of it, but it was in the courthouse square in Noonan, Georgia. And you had to enter through the alley, and just knocked my socks off. So I had a friend living down there, and we made it and only open Monday through Friday because the courthouse, right, is what brought in people for lunch. That's the only people who need lunch in the middle of the day in that town, right? So yeah, Monday through Friday, only open for lunch, enter through the alley. Yep. Absolutely perfect.
And what was the town? What part of Georgia? What town in Georgia?
Noonan, Georgia.
Noonan, Georgia. Okay.
I've got one for you guys, and it's nowhere near the Old South. I'm going to go Roscoe's Chicken and Waffles, Los Angeles. Does this count? Does this count as soul food? Am I good?
Yeah. And people get mad at me for pointing this out. A lot of people say that Black people invented chicken and waffles in the 1920s in Harlem. That's not the case. Chicken and waffles was around for a lot earlier than that. But it's certainly something that's been embraced in Black traditions. And if you go to Roscoe's, aside from the chicken and waffles and breakfast stuff, it's soul food. So I would definitely count Roscoe's as a soul food place.
I had never thought chicken or waffles went together. And I was like, everyone's going to, I went to Los Angeles for the very first time. I had friends out there. I was like, we have to go to Roscoe's. Okay, sure. And then I had the chicken and waffles together. And then this onion gravy that they put on that they gave to me changed me as a man, as a human being. I was like, I will never, ever, and I spent a lot of time in my kitchen, but I will never, ever, ever create something so glorious as what I had that day. It was just absolutely, I was like, from that day on, I became a chicken and waffles believer just because, it was just amazing. So any chance I can get out to LA, it's like, I won't go to the West Coast without stopping in because I just, I found it and I need it, in my, in my soul, if you will.
Along those lines, and, I'd like to add Saw's Soul Kitchen in Birmingham to the list, the Avondale location.
What do you get there?
Pork and greens.
Soul Kitchen.
Saws.
Oh, saws, like saw a tree limb.
Yeah, so
Okay.
yeah, the original owner, he's passed on, but his name was Mike Wilson. So SAW stands for Sorry Ass Wilson. But there's like 3 or 4 locations in the Birmingham area. Go to the Soul Kitchen, though, is Avondale.
All right, we're spending all of our time talking about food, which is good. But I want to ask you guys this now, like for our viewers here who want to our listeners here that want to learn more about like these movies and food and these intersections. I want to ask you guys about this. Like, you've got 3 movies about food, culture, and a book you can recommend. What do you go to and why?
So let me start with the book first. Anybody who wants to know about Southern food, I think they should read The Taste of Country Cooking by Edna Lewis. She was a remarkable figure in American culinary history. The book is kind of a memoir of her growing up in a place called Freetown, Virginia, community founded by formerly enslaved people, and it's seasonal. And it's a literary cookbook. I mean, she talks about life, what they were doing, and why they were eating certain things. It's just a beautiful book. And I just think people would have a greater understanding and appreciation of Southern food and its traditions if they read that book. So I would say The Taste of Country Cooking. In terms of food books or food movies, instead of, in addition to, soul food. So does I have to count that one, or do I need 3 more besides that?
You can give me 3. You can give me 33, however many you want to go with.
Okay. So a film that I really liked, and I don't know if you count this one, but Big Night, Stanley Tucci.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I just thought that was just a great film, and the way they bring food into it and everything, I just really liked that film. And then the other one, I really apologize. I just can't remember the name of it. And I saw it at a film festival, but it's a chef in kind of rural Korea, and it's just going through a day in his life. And I tried to find it before this. I just can't remember it. But it was really, it was great to look at a chef operating in another culture and see how he just goes about his day. And, a lot of times he was doing high level stuff, but then there were a lot of times where he was just, cooking for the elderly woman who can't get out of her, cabin in the village, right? He would just stop by and make a dish for her. It's just a beautiful film. I just can't remember the name of it, and it was probably I think you'll understand this. It was at a film festival. I went with a woman I really wanted to date. We never got to date, and so maybe I just blocked it out of my mind for that reason.
Entirely possible.
All right, so for books, I'm going to go a few places. I second The Taste of Country Cooking. I always assign the chapter on spring to my students in my food-related classes. So definitely got to go there. Definitely got to be transported to like a different time and place, because she talks about things that just blow my mind as like a city boy, like when chickens are at their best. I didn't know chickens had a season, but chickens have a season. I did
not know it. I know chickens have seasoning, but I did not know that they have a season.
Yeah, so you definitely have to visit Taste of Country Cooking. In fact, I want to make my students make something out of that cookbook next semester. Anyway, I'll go a few other places with the book recommendation, though. B. Wilson's Consider the Fork. Since reading it, I have not stopped thinking about the table knife, right? That we've designed something to work less effectively for a cultural reason. Right, and that's that people were stabbing each other at the tables, and and Victorians wanted that to stop, and so they invented a knife that couldn't stab anyone or cut anything. So
Wow.
Yeah, absolutely incredible. I'd also like to go to Edward Lee's Buttermilk Graffiti: Chef's Journey to Discover America's New Melting Pot Cuisine. Just all the interesting things that people are doing, around the country, and kind of how we got to where we are. For movies, so I have to admit, I'm a Francophile. My wife and I met at wine tasting. We both studied abroad in France, so I'm going to Ratatouille.
Absolutely. We've shown on HATM before.
Yes, absolutely. And
we are pro Disney, pro Ratatouille.
I'm also going to go back to France. I'm going to go to Chocolat. I think it's just a very whimsical movie. And I'm also going to go because I think we need to put it in the HATM series. A colleague and I, we want to do Cloudy with a Chance of Meatballs.
Absolutely.
Because I think there's
love
so
those.
many interesting things to say about the intersections between science fiction, dystopianism, and our cuisine. So,
Yeah. Oh, can I add one more movie? I just thought of one.
Yeah, absolutely. Go for it.
There was a movie, I think it was on Netflix only, but it was called Uncorked.
Yes.
It's the story of an African American. Has this already been on your podcast?
No. Go on.
Okay.
Please.
Yeah, so the story of an African American, young African American man who wants to be a sommelier, but he's born into this rib dynasty family, and his old man very much wants him to run the rib joint. And so I thought that was an interesting movie. Now, I think there was a missed opportunity because I thought they were going to do is show the dedication and the work it takes to become a sommelier and parallel that with what it takes to create barbecue.
Yeah, absolutely.
And there were flashes of that because like the opening scene when they're showing the ribs being prepped and some other stuff, I'm like, oh, here we go. And then it just never happens. And so, but it's still a very interesting film. And again, I think it's somewhat unconventional because you just don't hear about African Americans in the wine industry. And so I just thought that was interesting.
Yeah. Along those lines, I'd like to add, the new series Nomad with Carlton McCoy to the list.
What is this?
Well, CNN's still trying to fill the spot vacated by Anthony Bourdain, right? And I think, they see Carlton McCoy as an option here. But, it's really interesting because, it provides us, speaking of, African-American people in the wine industry, he's a classically trained chef and master sommelier. And so he's giving us actually like a different perspective than like Anthony Bourdain, right? Who, his credentials were drug use, right? And witty writing, and so to see, back to thinking about something in the movie, something Adrian's alluded to, the black chef or the black cook as someone, highly skilled, highly trained. In the movie, it's these women. In this case, right, it's Chef McCoy. I think that's a really important thing for audiences to see.
And Nomad is on what platform?
CNN. And their platform went away in like 2 days, right? So you got to actually be on cable or something.
Gotcha.
Have either of you seen the Chef's Table barbecue episodes? I want to say there's a really particular one. Adrian, you were just talking about, this dynamic between, say, becoming a sommelier and, a pitmaster. And I was thinking specifically about like Rodney Scott and like the episode with him. For people who aren't familiar with his story, I think he's out of Charleston. I went to his restaurant, a few months ago, but there was some real dynamics with him and his own father where, you saw this idea that he was going to shift off and go and become bigger. And his father was like, no, you need to stay here at the hometown thing. And, there was this huge, there was some real internal dynamics about that as well, about taking the family knowledge outside the family. It felt like.
Yeah, no, I did see that. And that was painful, man. Because you never want to see that play out, but it was real too. But it just certainly reminded me of Uncorked.
Yeah.
So Rodney Scott is from Hemingway, South Carolina, and so his family, he was associated with the restaurant there, and then branched out on his own. Now he's in Charleston, Birmingham, and Atlanta.
Before we come back to our last segment, I want to ask. I have to ask you because Mark's got this book coming on bacon. You guys have both written about barbecue exclusively. I've talked to both of you many times on the side about barbecue, and I have to know now. Where's the best barbecue in the United States, and why is it not Alabama?
So it is in Alabama. Well, the best barbecue is in your backyard, right? But besides that...
Oh, that's not fair. Of course it's my backyard because I can get to it easier. But where does one go? Where's the best tradition?
Well,
if we're going to pit regions versus regions because we don't want to end this thing peacefully.
Well, so
where's the best barbecue?
Alabama has more barbecue joints per capita than any place in the country, right? When Alabama did its Year of Alabama Barbecue campaign and they were putting that March Madness style like tournament together to figure out the best one, they got over, I think, 350 unique submissions. And
Goodness.
Wow.
and because they took it on Facebook, they think they may have gotten more if they had taken it with like pencil and paper, right? So when you're looking for a barbecue experience, I'll throw a couple out there, including one I just did. If you're thinking about barbecue and the best one, in the same way you might think of like the best wine you've ever had is always on the Spanish Steps in Rome, right? Right? Like when you're thinking about
For
atmosphere.
those of us who have not been to Spanish Steps in Rome or had the wine there, but yes, go on, Mark.
But when you're thinking about context and, you know, romance and, yeah, the scenery, I would put Archibald's in Northport on the list. So this place is always going to be special to me because I could smell it through the window of my apartment when I was in grad school. So when you get to those like fall football Saturdays, and you got the windows all open, it's just part of a ritual that I'll never go away from. So do that, eat it for lunch, because by dinner, I have to admit some of that stuff's been on there a little too long. And they might be sold out. So go for lunch. And that's when like the older generations are still cooking. So you've got all that training and experience and skill there. So I'll put that on the list. I'll also then again put Saws on the list. You know, they're doing some absolutely incredible things. If you're looking for an entryway, Jason, into white sauce, that is the one.
We are not looking for an entry in way. We are looking to vanish white sauce.
Yeah, smoked
ruining
platter
barbecue
with white sauce. It's really thick, so it like clings to the smoked meat really well.
No.
That's the way to go.
I think my position on white condiments, specifically mayonnaise, are well established at this point. But
it's beloved by many people who don't like mayonnaise. So
no, it's not. No, something else is calling to that. Adrian, what do you got? Where white sauce? Oh my God.
Yeah. So I'm a pork spare rib guy.
Thank you.
So my two favorite traditions are Kansas City, and that's a function of growing up in Denver. So that was the major influence. And then Memphis. I just love spare ribs.
But Memphis is a dry rub traditionally, right? And Kansas City's kind of got that ketchup-based kind of sauce, or no? Or
well, yeah, I mean, so Memphis has dry rub, but so you have to understand the dry rub is just at this one restaurant, the Rendezvous, which was owned by a Greek, child. I think he was the child of Greek immigrants, and so it's just a char-broiled slab of ribs with Greek seasoning on it. So the whole wet dry thing, I think, is a little overblown because it was really only that one place. But no, man, I mean, Memphis has got the spare ribs. Like, I love Cozy Corner, Payne's, the chopped pork sandwich, barbecue bologna, barbecue spaghetti. I mean, Memphis to me is barbecue's funky town in terms of all the different kind of stuff that they do. But I will say this, at the Rendezvous, I don't like the ribs, but the pork ribs, but I love the lamb ribs. And it makes sense that a Greek immigrant's going to be making some slam and lamb, but the lamb ribs are awesome there. So I highly encourage people to check those out.
Thinking about Alabama, I mean, Birmingham actually has a very large Greek population, and they're the ones that dominate a lot of the barbecue in Birmingham.
Yeah, is lamb on the menu?
No, not at any of the places I am thinking of on the top of my head.
That's really fascinating to me. I just thought they would pivot to that.
Has American barbecue caught on elsewhere, like outside the United States?
Oh, absolutely. Barbecue is huge. So I'll just say this, and the Texas barbecue, Central Texas barbecue, and what people think that is, has taken over the world. I was just recently in the Middle East, and Kuwait, Dubai, Oman, and Bahrain. And all of these dudes are coming back from the oil and gas jobs. They're coming to Texas for meetings. Somebody takes them out for barbecue and it changes their lives. They go back and they quit their oil and gas jobs and start doing barbecue.
Really?
And all these grad students too, same story. And if they aren't one of those two stories, you've got people just watching YouTube videos of Aaron Franklin and other people, and then through trial and error figuring it out and opening up restaurants. There's a place in Oman called The Land, short for Cleveland. The guy went to grad school in Cleveland, loved it there, comes back, and he's running a Texas barbecue joint in Oman as a nod to Cleveland based on videos that he watched on YouTube. And I got to tell you, it's some of the best pastrami I've ever had.
Really?
Yeah, because it wasn't a salt bomb, man. And it was just unctuous and it was just really good. Another funny story, Cairo. I'm in Cairo, Egypt. And I was talking to a bunch of chefs. And this guy comes up afterwards. He said, it would be my great honor if you came and ate at my barbecue restaurant. I'm thinking, whatever. But he was kind enough to invite me, so I made it happen. I go out to the restaurant. It's called Longhorn Barbecue. They've got a giant golden steer out front. They've got 2 huge smokers. Everything's in English. They've got saddles for seating. Every sports logo from Texas is on the walls. Everything's in English. Guy sees me coming to the front door. He runs to the door, opens it back up, and he says, "Welcome to Texas."
That's awesome.
So yeah, so American barbecue's hot in the Middle East, in Europe. They're doing a whole bunch of barbecue competitions in Europe. I have to say, the barbecue in the restaurants is very hit or miss. And then you've also got it in Australia and Japan. So yeah, American style barbecue is hot right now.
Yeah, I got a buddy who lives in the UK, and he'll like text me the pictures of the menu when he's at a place, and it'll have something that just says like Alabama barbecue. And I'm just like, I think there's a story there, because I think you're right. I think, the South is cool right now. Like, it is really, really cool right now. And, we imagine the South maybe, as outside of maybe our time and place, for good and for bad, right? We place all of our desires in it, and we place all of the blame for our problems on it. And I think, right, there's something romantic to people outside maybe the country about like Alabama and barbecue. So even if it's not Alabama barbecue, they're going to put those words on the menu, right? Because, if you're thinking about like an exotic place in the United States and you're living in the UK, I think that's maybe where your imagination's going to go. So,
well, let me ask, bring this back to Chicago. Let me bring this all the way back now to the movie we watched for Soul Food. Is Soul Food a history movie?
In a way, because it's highlighting a specific tradition, the soul food Sunday dinner, and it in a way it's preserving that tradition and arguing for its preservation and continuation. So I could say in some senses it is. It would have been cooler if we would have had a little more family context for these dishes. Like Big Mama said, "Oh yeah, I learned it from my mom's mom who was enslaved at this place." That kind of stuff. But we can't. I guess we can only guess so much of a mainstream movie.
Yeah, there's a difference there with the Mississippi roots, right? Where they're talking very specifically about we brought this. And...
Yeah. So I think that's something that you don't really hear in a lot of spaces.
All right, I think like all movies, it's a cultural text. It's a movie that cannot. I don't think it comes out anytime besides the 1990s. I think it's a picture of the class dynamics, masculinity and femininity. I think a line that really stands out to me is when, the sisters are talking and they're getting on Bird's case about her reaction to Lem losing his job. And it's like, you got to make him feel like a man, but then you also just got to take care of it. Right? Like, and I think, Big Mama at the beginning of the movie talking about like her husband being a gambler, right? And how, she never got on his case. She just went to work, right? So class, masculinity, femininity, mass incarceration, generational wealth, slavery, the Great Migration, all coming together here in the 1990s in this particular moment.
That's awesome. Guys, where can we find you online?
I am at Soul Food Scholar is my tagline, and I'm dropping knowledge like hot biscuits. That's my little motto. But yeah, you can find me on almost every platform if you do Soul Food Scholar. So I'm on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, but not as robust. I'm most robust on Facebook and Instagram and Twitter.
Have you gone TikTok yet?
No, I'm on there, but I haven't choreographed a dance yet, so that's why I haven't done anything.
I'm afraid of TikTok. I'm not even going to lie. I can't.
Well, look, I keep. People tell me it is fertile ground for historians, like little short. So I need to get on there and just do more. But I have a lot of people telling me, dude, people love that stuff, like little short historical stuff. So think about it.
Book talks.
Yeah, book talk's huge. Like some people have made a ton of money from book talk.
Real? What is book talk?
You got to find a teenager to do a dance for your book, right?
I have one.
Yeah. There's just, it lends itself to the elevator pitch. TikTok definitely lends itself to the elevator pitch. So I should probably get on there because a lot of teenagers are looking for Walt Stryker-esque interpretations of the Jim Crow era. But anyway, I'm at Mark Johnson 0208, which I might need to revise because when I came up with that, bots weren't really a thing. So maybe people think I'm a bot. But that's me. I'm eating bacon. I'm real. Okay, at Mark Johnson 0208 on Twitter and Instagram.
Awesome, guys. Thank you so very, very much for being here tonight. I love watching you guys' stuff on social media, just listening to you guys talk about food, but also watching you guys take pictures of food makes me want to eat the food. So, guys, thank you so very, very much. This was a blast. I'm so glad we could do this tonight. We gotta find another food movie and do it again because this was fun.
Well, I think the two of us, I think we do. I think we take a look at fried green tomatoes.
Oh, because there is a barbecue angle at the very end, isn't there?
Yeah, there's a barbecue and you have the Southern Diner and.
This is another movie I haven't seen that you're gonna like me.
I'm not gonna give it away. Not gonna give it away.
I started eating tomatoes in the last couple of years, so why not? Let's go.
Yeah, you need to check it out, man.
And that's a wrap here at Historians of the Movies podcast. Thank you to everybody for coming out and listening. Thanks especially to our guests, Adrian Miller and Mark Johnson. Historians of the Movies podcast is produced by Fletcher Powell and created by me, Jason Herbert. You can find us online at historiansatthemovies.com or on Twitter at Herbert History or by searching for the hashtag HATM. We'll see you next time. Thanks.